Hey, Laura, thanks for making the time to be here today.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Now, how we met is actually really funny because we were both at the MMT conference in San Diego last week. And I just finished dinner and two women, Katie and Lisa, that I know, at the conference came up to me and said, ask me what I do. And so I did, and they had this wonderful response. And of course, both of them they elicited the response of me asking the follow-up question of like, well, how do you do that? And they're like, oh, it worked. And they're like, oh man, this is so good. I finally can describe what I do in a way that engages someone in conversation and they feel compelled to keep going and asking more questions. And I've never had that before. I've always had this lengthy description, which I worry is causing people to nod off in the middle of it. And so I'm like, well, that's so cool. Like, how did you, wait, you haven't met Laura yet, have you? And I said, no, who's Laura? So that led to our introduction because I walked up to you to share those stories with you because both women were effusive in their praise of their experience with you. And I'm like, well, anybody that those two speak so highly of, I must meet. And that led to a lovely conversation in a hallway late after at the end of the conference, which I'm so grateful for. And that led to this podcast.
Yeah.
What did you do? I'm sure everybody's listening right now is like, what did she do though?
Oh
what was the thing? Yeah.
You're just going to have to wait one more second. So first of all, thank you for coming up and sharing that with me at the event, right? You could have kept that to yourself and not shared. And it meant a lot. Like, obviously the conversation that I had with these two women was impactful for them. And for me, I felt totally in my zone of genius and loved every minute. And then to hear that they went out and then did the homework I gave them immediately after and got the response that I anticipated they would, was such a gift that you shared that. So I appreciate it. And I always find at events like this, it's always those late night hallway conversations or some other random fill in the blank location.
Yeah.
That is when you have, some really meaningful conversations. So thank you for stopping me in that hallway. So, okay, what did I do? Well, we were having dinner and they were sharing about what they do. And, one of them just said, like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like, it's the same as what everybody else does. And just really struggling to like figure out what that differentiator was. And so we'd eaten, dinner was done. The three of us were sitting there and I just said, okay, tell me what you do. Just word vomit at me. Just start talking. And I will start to ask probing questions or I will listen. And so each one at a time started doing that. And I started to listen and I started to ask follow-up questions and I started to hear things repeated. I started to pull on threads of what they said. And through that was just able to, through the way they talked about things, or I think a lot of this is, to me, it's like, well, would I say it's easy? Maybe, but it is for me. Because I look at people's body language. I see their eyes. I look at things that keep coming up that they can't even hear themselves. And then I pull on those threads. And so I'm basically just telling them back things that they already are saying, but in this really powerful, concise way. I always say I take this messy, bunch of words and ideas that are in people's heads and I distill it down into a few words. And that's sort of my superpower. And I've never really done it in that kind of setting where it's like after dinner or just in this small setting where I've been able to do that. Normally my process is, weeks long and deep dives. And could we go deeper and get more specific and more robust? Absolutely. But to be able to get them such powerful messaging in a matter of 15, 20 minutes kind of reminded me that is my gift.
I think the thing that I really appreciated about that gift was how compelling it was to ask a follow-up question. Like for both of Lisa and Katie's statements, there was no way to leave it. Like I couldn't walk away just like, oh, that's interesting. Like, thank you for sharing that. There was a hook in the way that you described that. So what is that? Like what is that? What's in there in the background that made me so compelled to ask the follow-up question of how?
I think I'm like, whenever it's something that makes people lean in and go, ooh, tell me more. Like that curiosity, it's like you give them enough that makes them, like you said, not be able to walk away from the conversation. Whether or not they're the right client for you or not, ultimately it's about creating that conversation piece and having people just go, ooh, Okay. And the more words you use, the less compelling and memorable, and that people will lean in. So being concise and just learning to shut up is probably the hardest thing. People just want to keep talking. But they each came to you and said something that was probably less than 5 words in and around there. And then they stopped talking and waited for your response. And then you went, ooh, how do you do that? Say more. And that's exactly how the conversation starts. Then you can get into the details and the how and the why, but you have to pique people's curiosity first.
I walked away from those conversations and I felt like I just watched the coolest 2-minute movie trailer. And then I was like, I really want to see the movie now. That's that feeling of feeling compelled for what was next is exactly how I felt in both those conversations.
That's a great way to describe it. It's their personal movie trailer.
And so why this work? Like what drew you into doing not just this work, but the work that you do? And maybe as a starting point, what is it? Just because sure the listeners like, okay, I think I'm following so far, but who's Laura and what does she do exactly? Yeah. So I'd love to maybe start with that. Like when somebody asks you today, what is it that you do? What's your statement? Maybe let's start with that. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
And then from there, I'd love to hear the history that brought you to this work.
Absolutely. So I help founders create their legacy brand.
Okay. So how do you do that?
Well, I help them position their business to exit from a branding perspective, and then I help them with their personal brand for what's next.
And this is a fascinating time for you to be in this work, because I think the intersection of the brand for a business is one thing, but the founder brand or the leader brand is just as important. And I think for a long time, the ethos was if you're building a business and you want to exit that business, you really need to make sure that it has nothing to do with you, that you're kind of hidden in the background, that the business stands on its own brand. And the world really, I think through social media has moved away from that because of a couple of things. One, the personalization of brand and the wanting to work with real people, not just worked with brands, and there being some incredible personalities and people who the people that know them well love them and adore who they are in the world and how they show up in the world, but they've never had a personal brand out there that people that hadn't met them before could relate to and want to be engaged in, that was then connected to the brand that they are the founder of or the entrepreneur or the CEO of. So it feels like you're right in the midst of you're right in the intersection of one of the most important changes in marketing that's occurred in the last kind of 10, 15 years.
Absolutely. And I think there is a way. So you don't want a brand to be founder centric. However, you want a founder to have a personal brand.
Right.
And those two things can exist side by side. They can work together. They can communicate. Ultimately, a founder's personal brand has an immense ability to build the business brand. But guess what? When you sell, you get to take your personal brand with you.
Right.
While you leave the business behind. So even if you're a behind the scenes founder and you're not forward facing, this is the challenge that so many founders get into, is that they're so immersed in their business. It's their baby. Their whole life and identity is wrapped up in that business, even if they're not the face of it, that when they sell, they have a crisis of identity. So, and I've seen that happen. The number of times I've worked with a founder like 3 years after an exit, and they're like, oh my God, where were you before I sold my business? Because they had an existential crisis when they exited. And so I really want to help them while they're still in the business. And maybe, it's rebranding to get their family name off of it or their first name off of it, because they're like, it's too personal. I don't want to sell my name with a business, or they are the face of the business. And we need to pull them back a little bit so that the business brand can stand on its own and their personal brand helps in the building, but that it's its own entity. And so when they do exit, they understand who they are. They're a thought leader in their space, and they can go on and build or do whatever it is they want after. And their whole identity isn't tied up in their business.
Everything you said led to the genesis of this podcast.
Amazing.
So this podcast, The Mike Method, exists because I did an acquisition last July of a competitor, and the CEO of that business is now the chief growth officer at my company. And the first thing she said as we started going down the path of the acquisition was, how come you don't have a personal brand? Like your business brand has been, is out front, and you've been doing this for, at that point, 24 years, but you don't actually have a personal brand. And she says, getting to know you, getting to know your team, and then getting to know the people around you, there's this thing you do in the way that you live that is very intentional in your friendships, in your marriage, and how you parent, and how you show up as a leader, in how you show up in all the communities of your life. And she said, that's like hidden. It's like you don't express yourself fully out in the world. And she said, I think people need to see that so that they can understand where Virtus, the company, actually came from and what's actually behind all of that. And so that was actually the genesis of starting the podcast, and calling it the Mike Method was actually, that was Steph's idea, partly because if your name is Mike, things like mic drop are, I think there's 37 of those. That's taken by like 37 other people, right? Open mic. Everybody else thought about that too. So
there's just too many mics out there.
Too many mics out there in the world, and also, microphones. And so we ended up with the Mike Method, and really exactly as you've described, which was to build. And so this is not a business podcast attached to my company, although I am the CEO of my business. The purpose of this was to be able to express what I've learned along the journey. And I've been so lucky to meet the most unbelievable people through my travels, like just the most phenomenal people. And I walk away from conversations like I walked away from our conversation in the hallway in Del Mar, California last week, and think to myself, man, we should have just recorded that, because that would have made a fantastic podcast. And I thought that so many times, like, I'm just going to start doing that. And that's really this podcast is me finding these phenomenal people that I would love to just have a microphone at a coffee chat or a lunch chat with them and have that conversation live out in the world. And it just so happens that also helps to build a personal brand, instead of hiding behind the brand of my business. So that's my personal experience of everything that you just described.
Yeah. And I've seen some stats. I share this in some of my speaking, specifically about personal branding, is that something shared on a personal platform, like your personal LinkedIn, for example, gets over 500 times more reach than if it's shared on your business platform.
That's 500 times more reach if it's personal over business. That's staggering.
Yeah. And leads convert 7 times greater when something is when it comes through a personal channel. So if you and your team, like, imagine if everybody that works with you, or if every company invested in personal branding for their team, and those team members felt empowered to share interesting things and stories on their social media. Imagine what you could do for your business.
That's to have a 7 times lead conversion rate from a personal connection. And a personal brand, and then the magnifying effect of every team member being able to build out that brand online. That's a significant lead generation funnel. But it's also, I think, as I say to the team all the time at Virtus, like, we're in the business of relationships and trust. And when we have that, we get the unique opportunity and privilege to be able to do leadership development within these large organizations. But let's not forget that it's always in that order. Yeah. And so I think, what I hear you saying is, imagine if we could even magnify that by building up the personal brand of each of the individuals in the organization. That's a huge magnifying effect.
Yeah. I was brought in December to do a session with a team, like, I think they were around 25 people, and we did a half a day on personal branding. So each of them could understand the importance of their personal brand, what they stand for, and just the team members each getting to know each other better and understanding. And I weave in storytelling. I have a whole storytelling framework that I teach people, because I think a lot of times people don't know how to talk about what they do, whether you're a founder or you're an employee. What do you share? How do you share it? And so I have a whole methodology around storytelling that is using your own personal experiences. It could be funny stories, poignant stories, difficult, whatever those are. But ultimately, it all leads back to something that you do in the business, and people remember stories. And so imagine if every team member was leveraging their social media, understood what the business brand was about, how their personal brand aligns with that business brand, and then understood how to use their own stories to start positioning themselves. Maybe they want to be seen for an advancement in the company. Maybe they want to move up. Maybe they want to have a bigger impact on the business. And if you can align the business brand, the personal brand, and stories, like that's a powerful trifecta.
You're reminding me of a quote from a friend of mine, an author and speaker, Dan Ponifract. And he said, we aren't human doings. We're human beings. And I think when most people introduce themselves, they introduce themselves from the human doing perspective. Like, I'm the VP or director or manager of this portion of my company, and I do these tasks there, which is kind of the end of the conversation for the most part. Right? It's not very compelling. It's like, good to know, nice to meet you, the end.
Yeah, it's a title.
And I think, right? And then from a human being perspective, like we always say when we're building trust in organizations, we build trust at our human foundation level, not at the roles we play within the company. So the more that commonalities that we can figure out and the closer we can feel connected to others, the faster we can build trust. And that's really the concrete foundation on which, any team is built. And so if we're starting from a place of sharing a personal brand, that's sharing the essence of who we are, there's going to be either a commonality that occurs as a result, like something that I'm equally passionate about, or I have some working knowledge of. And if not, that I have a curiosity for. Because, right, I'm asking you now about who you are in the world as a human being, not who you are in the world of human doing and what your role is in a company.
And I think that's the beauty of, the event that we met at too, is we didn't even really know what each other did. Like, we don't know the human doings of each other, but we connected on this deeply human being level. And then we went and figured out and understood more about each other. And I think leading with that is always more powerful.
I think, I don't even think in our conversation, I don't know how long we spoke for, probably 45 minutes in the hallway. I think it was the end of our conversation as we talked about your 10 months away in Italy with your family and the readjustment to coming back and what it was like to, sort of re-enter in life and look at the habits and patterns and behaviors you had from Italy to, to your boys missing their cousins who they now knew and they had somebody to miss in the world that they didn't really know before
you remembered
that.
A lot from our conversation.
Well, it was fascinating because it wasn't, we weren't just talking about work stuff. We were talking about life. I think it was the end of the conversation when we finally got around to, so what is it that we both do for work? Like, it was like an afterthought to the conversation as we were wrapping it up. And I think that just underscores that when we are willing to be vulnerable and authentic and connect on our human level, that we may talk about the things we do day to day, but we'll talk about them in a very different way. And we'll connect around those things we do for work and career and what our passions and purpose is in a very different way when we've spent the time to meet each other at our most human level.
Yeah. And I will say that you make it easy to be that way with you. That, we met in this brief moment in a hallway and it was just so easy to connect with you. So you have a way of drawing people in and making them feel seen and heard and connected to. And the conversation was easy. And like you said, the time just flew by. And that's not always the case with everybody. So I think you bring a lot to the conversations, definitely the one that we had. And I can only imagine that you are like that with everybody.
It's a choice. It's a choice. And so I think for listeners who are like, well, I'm not that way, like I'm not one of those people, I think my response would be, it's a choice of how to engage in conversation. It's not accidental. It's not who I am in the world. I mean, arguably you could say it's who I am in the world because I've been doing it that way for so long. And I learned a long time ago that if I wanted to build relationships with people, not just know people, because I always found going to networking events was painful. So like, are we trading business cards, talking about what each other does, figuring out whether we're supposed to sell something to each other, and then like either having a follow-up conversation or moving on. And I used to come home for those and like, why did I go to that? And then I learned, and I can't remember who I learned this from, that like, get curious about people's actual lives, like not what they do, what their job is, where they work. Like, it's the most boring way to start a conversation, but instead like find out interesting things about who they are as a human being. And then like, eventually you can talk about work stuff if it's like, important or you feel like you need to know, will completely change the types of relationships that you have, and it won't feel like networking anymore. It'll feel like fun. Like it'll feel engaging and fun to get to know cool and interesting people. Jason Gaynor would quoted at MMT last week. He said, and I forget who said this quote originally, but he said, if you keep scratching, eventually everybody is absolutely fascinating. You just need to keep scratching. And that approach has really changed the course of every interaction that I have had since I started doing that. And it's been like, I don't know, 25 years that I think I've been doing that. So it's partly who I am now. And I want to be super clear that it's a choice, and it's really a deliberate thing you get to do. And then it becomes habitual. You just don't start conversations the way everyone else does. And it really changes the quality of the relationships that I have in my life, and in a way I'm unbelievably grateful for, that I learned that young enough that I could change the course of the relationships I've had in my life.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's intentional is such an important word in what you just said. And that's absolutely how I live. And I have these words that I live by, and one of them is connection. And so if that's something I know I'm going into today, or when I was at MMT last week, it's being intentional and being fully present in the conversation that I'm in, as opposed to like thinking about the next thing, or where do I have to be, or is there somebody else I want to talk to, that, when you start seeing people's eyes look over your shoulder, like, oh, there's somebody else over there. But like, no, I'm fully present in this conversation right here, right now. I almost missed the kayaking because I was so deep in conversation, and suddenly I realized that everybody had started leaving from lunch, and I was like, oh, I better get moving. But I mean, that's the beauty of being intentional and having these deep conversations, is you get to know people so well, and you never know what's going to come from that, whether it's a friendship or business or a collaboration or somebody that you can help or they can help you, whatever that looks like. It's an amazing feeling to have these deeply meaningful conversations with people.
And so when you think about building a personal brand in the context of getting people to know who you are before they even meet you, before you get a chance to get into that conversation with them, I mean, what are the venues today that people are sort of broadcasting what their personal brand is? I mean, obviously the obvious one, we're on a podcast right now, so I guess I'll call that out. And, I'm sure websites is probably another one where everybody's on social media. When you start to think about building out a personal brand for someone, what are the platforms, or what are the areas that you want to first, like, what's the, like, what ground floor, where do you start? And then what's the journey that you want somebody to be on? Because I can imagine that a listener is like, I got to have a podcast, I got to build a website, I got to have this presence on LinkedIn, I've got to, get my Instagram going. Am I supposed to be on TikTok too? Because I want to reach the younger people, right? Like, I heard Snapchat's more important now. Like, is Facebook still a thing? Like, it feels, or it could feel a bit overwhelming to even get started in this process. And I'm wondering, what's the journey that people need to think about, and what are the simple steps that they can take to start to move down this path?
Yeah. So the first thing we always do is that messaging piece. So I have a methodology called Brand Camp, and I take all of our clients through Brand Camp. It's as fun as it sounds, I promise. And that's about that's getting to that couple of words, the heart and soul, the essence of the brand. And then with that, that's the foundations. Like, you can't build a house without a foundation. It will fall if you don't have that proper structure. So this is like that foundation, but it's not something you see visually. It's that kind of behind the scenes. But what that does is then everything you could mind map and go, okay, if I know, for me, the essence of my personal brand is all around legacy. Okay, well, how can I live that? How can I talk about it? What are all the different ways that I can, showcase that? And you can build out from there. Everything you create content wise should lead back to the essence of your brand. You don't have to start with a website, especially as a personal brand, depending on what you're doing. Like, if you're a speaker or an author, or you're offering some different things, then yes, you will need the visual brand and a website. But sometimes as a founder, you don't need any of those things. You need the foundational messaging, And then you need to know how to use it. So we offer ongoing like monthly brand strategy. I've been started creating like custom GPTs for my clients so they can start to build out content that has all of the brand foundation, samples of how they write and speak integrated right into it so that it makes it an easy no-brainer. So I always say start using social media, right? If LinkedIn is your platform, post on LinkedIn. And don't say you're going to post 5 days a week. If you know realistically, you can start with one time a week. Then start with one time a week. Don't do 5 days a week for 3 weeks and then don't post anything for 6 months. Consistency is key. So, do you have a visual language? Do you need a photo shoot? Do you think there may be some key things? And again, I would provide those recommendations strategically based on what are your goals? You want to be seen as a thought leader. You want to get on stages. Okay, there's some things we need to do to position you for that. Is it writing a blog? Is it putting yourself out to be a guest on other people's podcasts? So there's all kinds of different ways to do that. I worked with a business founder recently and we did just that. We actually framed out the title of a talk that she could deliver, a podcast one sheet, a speaker sheet, some ideas for storytelling she could incorporate into her social media platform that is all leading back to, her business, but also her as a thought leader in her space. So ultimately, while we're a full service design, business, we can design everything from color palette to logos and websites and social media. We can do all those things, but without the messaging first, everything else will fall flat. And sometimes all you need is that and the strategic guidance so that you know how to start putting yourself out there in the world.
So let me reflect back on what I've heard from you so far. So I think when you said your word is legacy, it made me think about other people out in the world, like Simon Sinek decided to own Why, Brene Brown decided to own vulnerability, Esther Perel decided to own relationships, right? So there's this key, Alex Hormozy, growth. There's people who've said like, one, I just got to come up with the word first. So I love that because I love the simplicity of figure out what the one word is that's going to start the whole thing. Then we'll figure out what the 5 or 6 words are that add a little bit more context to that. And then, if I was a listener right now, I'd be thinking, okay, and I don't have to be on every platform. I need to be on the right platforms. And my guess is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the feedback you would give to people is do fewer platforms or do fewer things really well, as opposed to just be on everything and go for have a book, have a podcast, have a LinkedIn profile, be on TikTok, be on other people's podcast, and on and on and on and on. Write a blog and do those things infrequently because you feel like your efforts are diffused and dispersed. Does it make more sense, I think, is what I'm hearing you to say, is to be on fewer things, do them really well, and do the things that matter based on the personal brand that you want to.
Yeah, I think it's understanding, where are those clients? Where can you have the most impact? Some of the content you can share across different platforms, you can repurpose it. But I would think, if you could pick 3 places to show up, whether it's social media, creating your own podcast or being a guest on podcasts, maybe writing a blog. The blog, honestly, for the longest time, I would write a blog and all of my social media content would be taking that blog post and turning it into small pieces of content. So start with the long form and then repurpose the blog. Okay. So there's ways to create one thing and then repurpose it. And the beauty is now we have AI. AI can actually make this much easier. But if you don't know where to start, if you don't have the foundational messaging and language, it's going to sound like everybody else. And then if you can add in the storytelling piece, that's where the magic happens because you're starting to share your own things that will resonate with people in a way that they'll get a little bit of insight into you. And again, it doesn't have to be deeply personal, but they could be like, oh, that's a cool fact about Laura. I didn't know that about her life. You see a photo of me kind of out in the wild outside of business. And yet I managed to connect it back to somehow or something that we do or the work that I do and the impact I want to have in my business. And that's when the magic really starts to happen.
I love the simplicity of starting with a word, going to that short sentence, figuring out from there, what are and I'm sure values are a piece of this as well, to understand personal values around the message. And then really leading from there to decide which platforms are the ones that make the most sense for you to double down on. And then remember that it's not net new content on every platform, that maybe you've written an article or a blog post, or maybe you did a podcast and then you took some video snippets from that, or you took some key messages from a blog post, and those become, quick Instagram stories, or they become quick LinkedIn pieces that actually link back to the longer blog posts if people are more interested in reading the long form content. That feels so much more palatable or doable, I guess, actually be the better word to use, than trying to imagine I got to be everywhere all the time on all these platforms. And I know for me personally, when I tried to do that, my efforts ended up getting diffused, and over time I just sort of felt burnt out on all of them, as opposed to now where I feel like, okay, I know where I need to be and I'm only in those places. And I've made very conscious choices in the case of Instagram, where my Instagram is private. Right. So that platform I just use mostly for me, although the podcast is reshared there. So that's a very closed channel. But obviously LinkedIn is a much wider channel. Facebook, I'm much more liberal with. I do a lot of stuff on WhatsApp, which, people say, well, that's not really a social channel. Actually, it is, because the fact that I'm in a lot of groups with large volumes of people within those groups. And and then personal website, which is new over this past year. And then again, the podcast and the pieces that come from this. And I find that feels doable. I'm not on TikTok in a meaningful way. I'm not on Snapchat in a meaningful way.
No, me either.
Yeah. And Facebook, I would say I'm not really on there either. So it's really narrowed down to a personal account on Instagram, and then LinkedIn being the key place where I'm expressing myself in the way that you've described outside of this podcast and the website. And that feels, I can manage that. I feel like and I can be authentic. Like I don't need to rely on AI or a team of people crafting messages and then trying to be me in the world. I can actually manage that and still run a company and be a dad and be a good husband and a family member and a friend and all those other roles that I play in my life.
Yeah. And I think it's, I actually got a lot of comments that people say, I see you everywhere. And I'm not everywhere.
Right.
I'm probably mostly on LinkedIn, Instagram, but I have an email newsletter. I have the podcast. So I do have YouTube. Like I am in multiple places, but I do always find it interesting where people are like, oh, I see you everywhere.
Right.
And a lot of times people will comment on things I've posted, but I know they haven't liked or commented on my post. So we don't always know who's watching or listening.
Right.
So you can't just look at the number of likes or comments on your posts, because it's not there. People are seeing your stuff, even if they're not stopping, if they recognize it. So this is where consistency from a visual perspective plays a huge part. I am wildly consistent with my brand.
Right.
You will see me, you will see it's mostly black and pink. I use a lot of black and white photography. You're going to see my post now and be like, that's Laura. Even if you don't stop and read what I've written, it doesn't matter. It's a touch point with my brand. And those are all important. So people don't realize how much they're losing by changing up the look of their posts and their visual brand, and how that does their brand a disservice. They're like, ooh, look at this fun color, this fun background from Canva. Canva is a brilliant tool, but you've got to maintain the integrity of your brand. People have such a short attention span. The saying, people have a shorter attention span than a goldfish. And it's even shorter, because of, I think everybody's got to have ADHD now with the way, we're so used to this quick, short, content on social media. And I read a study that we see about 100,000 words a day. So how do you capture people's attention? You need to stand out. You have to have great content. But even if people aren't reading it, if they recognize it visually while they're scrolling past your post with their thumb moving, even if they see it, that visual cue will make them think about your brand.
It's funny that you say this, because I was actually on Apple Podcasts last night and I scrolled past the Tim Ferriss podcast. I don't know how many thousands of episodes he's had. And then I saw the Joe Rogan podcast, and he again, thousands of episodes. And I looked at the imagery and I thought to myself, this is the same imagery they've had since the very beginning. They have pretty big budgets for production and graphics, and they have a whole support team. And
Mm-hmm.
yet I don't think they would have picked today if they created their masthead for their podcast. It wouldn't look like that. And then I thought to myself, right, but they can't change it because I skimmed by and I didn't need to look at the words. I knew that was the Joe Rogan podcast. I knew that was the Tim Ferriss podcast. I know that that's the Rich Roll podcast. I know what Chris Williamson and Modern Wisdom looks like without even any words. It could just be the colors and I could tell you that that was that podcast. So I hear your point that once you've picked that visual, whether or not you get tired of it is irrelevant. It's really that staying consistent with black and pink, as you say, and black and white photography, because when they're looking for anything from Laura Beauparlant, they know that it's going to look and feel a certain way. They just need to, their subconscious is actually twigged by it before their conscious mind even recognizes that they're looking at the thing they're looking for.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean your brand can't evolve. I'm all
Right.
about, is it evolution or revolution? Sometimes you need to throw everything out and start again. And sometimes it isn't evolution. My brand has evolved.
Mm-hmm.
I even remember when I started, because we've got many colors in our brand, I'm a colorful person, but I started really focusing on, had these amazing black and white photos. And, I started putting it with the pink. And the feedback I was getting, more people were commenting, it was recognizable. And it's like, oh, this is what people are noticing of all the content I've shared over the years. So you are still allowed to tweak and modify and refine and really listen to the feedback, because now that's the way I've really, really gone with it. Doesn't mean I won't use those other colors, but that will be the primary one.
And I have to say, for the people watching this on YouTube, they'll have probably already seen this. But for the people that are listening on Spotify or Apple or all the different channels this podcast is on, might not have seen the pink highlights that you have in your hair. So I mean, you've really taken the personal branding thing from a visual perspective. Like obviously your lipstick is pink, that could change. But the fact that you've got pink highlights in your hair says a lot.
They faded a bit. You can't see them too much right now, but
they're there. They're there,
yeah,
right?
They're there.
And in person, they're there, and they're remarkable and in a great way, which ties in so well to your personal branding.
Yeah, it was funny at the event. A friend of mine was talking to somebody and mentioned my name and said, "Oh, have you, met Laura?" And they're like, "No, who's, which one? Who is Laura?" And they're like, "The one with the pink hair." Mm-hmm. And so that's all she had to say. She didn't say blonde curly hair. She said the one with the pink in her hair, pink hair. And they're like, "Oh, yep." They knew exactly who she was talking about. So again, it's that, how do you stand out in a room, and be memorable and easy to describe. And, I am wearing my floral jacket. So I'm usually in some kind of bright color or floral print. And, I've got pink in my hair, and that has just become part of my personal brand. I often share the story that I used to straighten my hair to fit in I thought people would take me more seriously. And it was so interesting when I stopped doing that, how my curly hair is also part of my personal brand, which sounds silly, just like my pink hair, but people recognize you. People would recognize me from my profile picture on social media. They'd recognize me from the back at a networking event, because it's not as typical. And I just embraced them, and I realized, oh, this is my authentic self. As kind of trite as it sounds, whatever those things we're doing to hide ourselves, like straightening our hair or dressing a certain way or talking a certain way, is actually holding us back and preventing people from really getting to know who we are.
I've got a good friend, Jeff Duncan, is a buddy from Vancouver who's an EO member, and he's got a firm called Ingenuity Live, and he is the mastermind behind a lot of these key influencers on Netflix, on Instagram, and on TikTok. Sorry, he's the one in the background that's actually orchestrating and managing and supporting their careers to make sure that they are doing the right deals, the right sponsorship deals, being in the right places, getting on the right TV shows. And he started wearing black baseball caps. And I noticed it because I'm like, Jeff's got great hair. And it was night or day, Jeff always had a black baseball cap. And it wasn't a particular black baseball cap. It could be a team that had a black baseball cap. It could be a generic one, but he was always wearing a black baseball cap. And I realized, it took me a second. And then I realized, I get it. This is a personal branding thing, because it's nighttime. And so you're not shielding your eyes. and we're at a more formal event, but you're still wearing a black baseball cap. And so that is a key sort of style thing that he's chosen to pick up, that in the influencer world, if he's out at an event, you just as somebody, actually, as Lisa and Katie said to me before you and I met, they said, Laura, oh yeah, she's over there. She's the one with the pink highlights.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh, okay, perfect. And I'm like, okay, this is a purpose. And I knew right away when I looked over, I'm like, this is a personal branding. So I don't know what you do, but I have this gut feeling this is a choice. Just the same way Jeff, who I know really well and have known for 15 years, started wearing black baseball caps of all different descriptions. And I'm like, okay, this is a personal branding thing, because he's in a world where people need to point him out at a film festival, at a concert, at an event in Vegas, at a Netflix opening, and be able to say, oh yeah, he's the one in the black baseball cap. And you literally know he's always going to have some type of black baseball cap on. So it's a powerful choice. It's a very deliberate choice to do that. But I love how easy it is then for people to be able to introduce you. And it doesn't have to just be something that, you've chosen to do something with your hair. It can be glasses. It can be something you're wearing around your neck. It could be all sorts of things, right? That you choose to do that make you stand out in the world in a way that makes it much easier for people to reference who you are.
Absolutely.
What are some of the more, so I know you've done a lot of this work. I'm curious, we've got 2 examples here that we both just shared. What are other examples that you've seen that people have done that are very purposeful, personal branding things that are visual in nature, that that stand out for you, where you're like, this person does this, I love it because it's so clear. You just have to reference this one thing and everybody knows who you're talking about.
Yeah, I had a client a few years ago. I'm still in touch with her, and she's a speaker and she runs workshops, and she's got this giant mane of red hair.
Yeah.
And just embracing it, not hiding it, not straightening it, just fully embracing it. And then she also she was a boxer, or she did boxing. And so we actually, when I was helping her art direct a photo shoot, we have pictures of her with her boxing gloves and how she brings that into the brand. So she's got a really big personality. And I'm like, you can't hide that part of your personality. That's really, really important. Oh my gosh, we've worked with so many. It's hard to pull off the top of my head. But I will also say that I've worked with a lot of speakers. And the thing that I find interesting, I remember working with this one gentleman, and he was going to be speaking in front of a bunch of business people. I think it was a bunch of lawyers. And he was going to show up dressed like all the lawyers that were going to be in the room. And I was like, no. You need to show up like you're speaking in front of a room of lawyers, not you can't look like everybody else. It's like a groom at a wedding. I totally disagree that your groomsman should be wearing the same suit as you. Why shouldn't the groom get to look special at the wedding?
The bride does. Right?
The bride does. Why not the groomsman? Why not the groom? And so you should look like you're the one being paid to be speaking in front of the room, and you get to wear whatever you want to wear that aligns with your personal brand. And he was like, he'd never thought of that before. He thought he needed to look like everybody else in the room. I'm like, no, you don't need to change yourself. You're the one on the stage presenting. Everybody should be looking at you, and you should stand out in that room. And so afterwards, they can find you easily in the room, as opposed to oh, you blend in with everybody else. I'm going to be the easy one to spot. Yeah, where's the speaker, right? No matter how tall or short you are, if you're dressed differently, as long as it's aligned with who you are in your personal brand, not trying to be somebody else. But I don't believe in trying to fit into somebody else's mold.
I love that. There's an MMTer that's a friend of ours. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to meet him yet, his name is Jesse Cole. And he has a baseball team called the Savannah Bananas.
Oh my God. And so, I'm dying to go to a Savannah Bananas.
It's so much fun.
Have you been?
Yes. So Jesse hosted us when we were in Savannah for MMT a few years back. It was a blast. I mean, they have taken entertainment and baseball to a whole other level. It's going to an incredible stage performance, and they happen to be playing baseball while you're there. It's like if Cirque du Soleil decided to start playing baseball. That's literally what Jesse has done. Jesse is famous for having an all yellow, I think it's nylon suit with a top hat, and wears that at all the games, but will also wear that at other events where he needs to be memorable. And he just owns it. And, some people say, well, I don't have the courage to do that. And it's like, well, here's the thing, like, do you want to be memorable or not? And so if you want to blend in and fade into the background, then you definitely won't be memorable. But it doesn't take wearing a yellow tuxedo, right? You've got very light pink highlights that are in your hair. Jeff decided to wear a baseball cap. There can be very subtle things that you can do that you own that will make you incredibly memorable. I love this as a way to wrap for today because it's such a powerful statement for people to think about something that they could take that is truly them and unique, and to make that a signature thing for them. So I implore you as a listener, what could be the signature thing that is about you, that you wear, or is around you all the time, that makes you somebody that people could easily spot across a room, or very easily help navigate another person towards you, simply because of something that you wear or you're carrying with you on a regular basis. So, Laura, I really appreciate you making time to have this conversation. It was like a fascinating conversation to hear.
My pleasure. So
how
fun.
your mind works and how you help people to explore who they are in the world and put out a personal brand in a way that helps to elevate their presence, so that, as you say, they can get a 7 times multiple on a return on the conversations they are having in their life, that people are 7 times more likely to want to engage with them in the business that they are because of their personal brand. So thank you for making the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.